London is one of the most haunted cities on earth. With centuries of blood, fire, plague and war, there's a ghost story lurking on almost every street corner. But it doesn't stop above ground. The London Underground is said to be crawling with spirits too. Figures that vanish in front of your eyes, phantom passengers forever riding through the tunnels, and even legends of the devil himself visiting a witch's cottage. So mind the gap, because for this episode, we're getting all into the haunted stations on the Northern Line. Did I know what I was letting myself in for when I first started the research for this one? No, I absolutely did not. It gets really dark in this one, so be prepared. But not only that, oh my life, this line is confusing. It's definitely one of the most tangled up lines in the London Underground. And that's because it's actually the product of two early railway lines that effectively got stitched together into the line that it is today. In 1890, the City and South London Railway opened up between Stockwell and a station that's no longer operational called King William Street, becoming the world's first deep-level electric tube railway. But then in 1907, the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway opened, which headed north from Charing Cross to Camden Town, where it then divided into two, with one line going on to Golders Green and the other to Highgate. In the 1920s though, these two lines were connected together, and by 1937 it was renamed to the Northern Line, which came from the ambitious project called Northern Heights, which wanted to expand the line further north. And while that project didn't actually happen, the name stuck. But with all the history stretching back into the 19th century, alongside everything that the stations on the Northern Line have seen in that time, it is no surprise that a lot of people find themselves feeling a bit uneasy when they're down there. Drivers and station staff sometimes report seeing people walking on the tracks late at night, but when they go to check it out and get them out of harm's way, there's never anyone there. But even passengers too, they see things that they can't explain. Like the story of someone spotting a sickly looking pale man in a bowler hat who was riding on the Northern Line, only for others to realise that the seat that he was supposedly sitting in was completely empty. But the first stop that deserves a mention is Balham Station, and we are just getting straight into it with the tragedy. There is no easing into it with this episode, I'm afraid, because just like a lot of the underground stations in London during World War II, Balham was used as an air raid shelter. And I mean, I said this before when we were talking about the ghosts on the Central Line, but I would feel a heck of a lot better camping out down underground than anywhere else in the city, really. But being underground didn't mean that you were safe, because at a couple of minutes past 8 in the evening, on the 14th of October 1940, a 1,400 kilo semi-armour-piercing bomb fell above the tunnels at Balham, creating an absolutely massive crater. A bus actually then drove into this crater, which, I mean, it would have been dark because of the blackout, but not seeing anything amiss in front of you and then just all of a sudden the earth has swallowed the entire bus up whole. That just seems to be adding insult to injury here, but no one on the bus was actually hurt, and I don't think it was loaded up with passengers anyway, as it was out of service. But unfortunately, the same could not be said for the people sheltering in the station. The blast had destroyed the gas, sewage and water lines, causing massive flooding. And so, according to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, 66 people drowned that night in sheer and utter panic and complete helplessness. News of the tragedy afterwards was kept quite hush-hush, as they didn't want to scare people away from using the underground as a shelter. But I mean, you can't keep something like that a secret. It was so bad that it actually took until the end of December to recover all of the victims, and then a further month before the station could reopen afterwards. But to this day, staff working at Balham occasionally hear the sounds of frantic screaming, like a horrific echo from that terrifying night. And apparently sometimes the atmosphere there can feel so heavy, so oppressive, that some employees just straight up quit right there on the spot, rather than work another night shift down there. And I mean, yes, coming face to face with a ghost in the middle of your night shift would be another level of scary that I cannot even comprehend. But I get it with Balham, feeling that atmosphere, and you also then know of how many people died here, and in such a horrible way. That is going to leave you feeling pretty uneasy. But if we move further north, a couple of stops, we get to Stockwell. And this station, it was also used as a shelter during World War II, so there is still going to be that sort of uneasy energy from that. But the truly horrific tragedy that Stockwell saw came much later. Because on the 22nd of July 2005, while London was still reeling from the 7/7 terror attacks that had happened just over a fortnight before, but that also another attack had been failed killed just the day previous, targeting 3 tube stations and a bus. An innocent man, Jean-Charles de Menezes, was mistakenly identified as a suspect from the previous day's attack attempt. Police followed him onto the train he boarded at Stockwell, where he was fatally shot multiple times. There's a Channel 4 documentary that goes into a lot more detail, but it all came out in the report that they'd said that he'd been acting suspiciously, he'd jumped the barriers, like all of this, but none of it was true. He was just another guy in London going about his day who had been mistaken for a terrorist. Just truly horrific. There is a memorial mosaic to Jean-Charles now at the station, just as a reminder of a tragedy that should never have happened. And so places like Stockwell, they don't only carry the weight and hold on to the emotion that Londoners would have been feeling during the Blitz, there are just these layers of more recent tragedies that leave their mark on the place. And maybe that's why some staff members say that they hate working at Stockwell, because the vibe down there can feel so eerie and unwelcoming at times. Apparently some passengers also report an overwhelming feeling of sadness when they're standing on the platform, but they have no knowledge of what happened there on that day in July 2005. But then there was also a really strange incident that happened back in 1984, and it wasn't necessarily at Stockwell station itself, but rather on the tracks of the Northern Line between Stockwell and Oval, the next station along. Because Paul Fisher, he was training to be a manager, and part of that training meant that he had to have first-hand experience of all the jobs that had to be done on the underground. And one of those jobs was walking the track and shining a torch around the tunnels, just checking for any issues, anything out of place, any problems. And as he was walking back from Oval towards Stockwell, in the distance ahead of him, he could just see this glowing light. He carried on walking towards it, and as the dim light grew a little bit brighter, he could see the silhouette of a man who appeared to be holding an old-fashioned lantern. And this man, he was standing in a part of the tunnel that was wider than the rest. It sort of opened up into this clearing where the man was just standing there. As he got close enough to see properly, Paul was totally shocked to see this elderly man standing there in this section, and he was a little bit confused as to why he was holding a tilly lamp, one of those paraffin-powered lanterns. But Paul, ever the professional, he greeted the man, and they had this brief conversation, exchanging pleasantries and whatnot. The man looked like he belonged down here, but aside from holding on to this vintage lamp. And so he just brought it up, he just asked about it. I mean, it is the 1980s, there are better light sources down here now. You could upgrade, maybe? But this mysterious man just responded saying, "Oh, I just prefer this lamp. I've been using it for years. It does the job just fine." Alrighty, I guess if it works for you. Paul then asked about this section that they were standing in. Why was it larger than the rest? And the older man went on to explain that this part was called South Island Place, named after the street above it, and it was basically a step plate junction between Stockwell and Oval, which trains had used as a crossover. Seemingly satisfied with those answers, glad that he'd learned a little bit of information that he could impress the bosses with, but yet still having a job to do, Paul said goodbye, and that was that. He carried on walking the tunnel towards Stockwell. Once he reached the station though, he just thought, you know what, I'm just gonna call it in. This is exactly the type of thing that you should let superiors know about, just in case there wasn't supposed to be anyone on the tracks. And I mean, yeah, the supervisor said, no, there shouldn't be anyone on the tracks. There are no scheduled works going on down there, anything like that. And so Paul and the supervisor had to then go back out into the tunnel to see if they could find him. Of course, they could not. The old man had completely disappeared. But still, Paul had called in this thing. They needed to try and at least find this man. And so it actually ended up pushing back the schedule for the early morning trains, causing this disruption. But still, couldn't find this guy at all. There was no trace of him. So that was that. The case was kind of closed and the train started running. But a bit later on that day, Paul got called into a disciplinary meeting, which he was very confused about. But his supervisor asked him, "Alright, let's cut to it. You clearly know the ghost stories about that tunnel, don't you?" I'm sorry, what? What ghost stories? It turned out that South Island Place had apparently been the site of a fatal accident back in the 50s, when a maintenance worker had been hit by an oncoming train. He had been working on a compressor, so he hadn't heard it or had the chance to get out the way. I didn't find a specific record of who this man could have been, or whether it even did happen, but that hasn't stopped this guy with the tilly lamp from being seen by staff members walking the tracks in this area. I did also find other versions of this story that said the poor guy was electrocuted instead, but again, still no record, no evidence of who this guy was, if he even did die down here. But if we move a little further along the Northern Line, the next station that I need to tell you about is Moorgate. And those of you who know, you know, because there was a horrendous crash at Moorgate, which was the most fatal peacetime disaster on the London Underground. And we still don't really fully know why it happened. So this didn't actually take place on the Northern Line. This was a train that was running on the Northern City Line. Very similar names, completely different lines, just to make it super fun and confusing. But basically, Moorgate was a terminus for the Northern City Line, meaning there was no train track for the Northern City Line going out of the station, only into it, and on the other side of the platform, a bit of an overshoot tunnel, but then a solid concrete wall. On the 28th of February 1975, a train slammed into the end wall of that tunnel at speed, killing the driver and 42 passengers. Over 70 other passengers were injured, with some having to undergo amputations to free themselves from the twisted metal where they were trapped. At the investigation into the crash, absolutely nothing wrong was found with the train, the tracks, anything like that. Mechanically, everything was working as it should have. And so it was concluded that it must have been something to do with the driver himself, 56-year-old Leslie Newson. It took them 4 days to reach the driver's cab, and the usually 3 feet long area where he had been working had been compressed to just 6 inches. When Leslie's body was recovered from the cab, though, it was found that he hadn't even attempted to apply the brakes, and his hand was still on the aptly named dead man's handle, which was basically the accelerator. You use your hand to press down on the accelerator, and if for any reason you let go, the train's brakes are applied. And so that just left everyone with more questions. What had Leslie been doing? What was going on with him in that moment? Some people suggested that he could have possibly been suffering from a petit mal seizure, an absence seizure, where the person loses consciousness, but to the outside, they're still there, but they're just staring straight ahead, just looking spaced out. And that seems to fit with what witnesses at the time had seen when the train came careening through the Moorgate platform. They'd said that Leslie looked completely calm, staring straight ahead, absolutely no fear or panic, but also that he made no moves to shield his face or anything. You know, that instinctive gut reaction to try and protect yourself when you see something coming right at you. There'd been none of that, almost like he had no idea what was about to happen. Others say that maybe he'd been suicidal and so he'd done it on purpose, but that doesn't seem to fit here. When his body was recovered, he had £300 in cash in his pocket, which he had withdrawn from the bank. The reason was that after his shift, he was going off to buy his daughter a car. So why make plans for after work? And so others say that maybe because of that he was distracted, maybe thinking about the car he was going to buy or thinking about all the other things that he needed to do and whatnot. But that didn't sound like Leslie at all. He was always described by colleagues as conscientious. He knew his job and he did it well. However, he had slightly overshot that platform twice the week before. Nothing major, but enough to be noted. Medical examiners thoroughly studied Leslie's body for any indication about what might have gone on, but found no evidence of a heart attack or seizure or anything like that. He'd been alive when the crash had happened, and he had died of his injuries. It is worth noting, though, that he had been stuck for 4 days in that very hot tunnel. Literally, it had reached 50 degrees Celsius thanks to the terrible ventilation and the hot power tools used to free the victims of the crash. And so his body wasn't in the best condition to make surefire conclusions. Full analysis of his brain was not possible anymore. And so while some sort of seizure or something like that seems the most possible, the truth is we're never really gonna know. After the crash, newspaper articles started coming out saying that perhaps there was a paranormal reason for what went on. Because apparently in the weeks leading up to the disaster, maintenance workers who had been carrying out repairs late at night in Moorgate Station had reported seeing the ghost of a workman, and he was wearing blue overalls and walking straight towards them. Initially, these maintenance workers who were seeing this guy, they just assumed, oh, he's someone, okay, not wearing the proper uniform, but just another one of the guys. Until this phantom got closer to them, and they all described how this man had the look of sheer, visceral, indescribable terror etched onto his face. Like full eyes bulging, mouth agape, white as a sheet, Oscar-worthy horror. That comes walking towards me in the middle of a tunnel in the dead of night. There ain't no way I'm showing up for work ever again. Forget that. So some people thought, oh, maybe Leslie had seen this figure and that had caused him to get so distracted he hadn't applied the brakes. And I mean, I don't really know about that theory. I see where it's coming from and all of that, but still, I just don't think it fits. Looking at all the facts and the witness statements, if he had been so shocked by seeing this ghost in front of him, whether he thought he was real, whether he thought he was dead, whatever, why had he looked so calm and unbothered seconds before the crash? I know it's absolutely not the same in any reality, but if I'm driving along and something scares me out in front of me, if there's a rabbit in the road or something like that, the first thing I do is shout, "Oh shit," before slamming the anchors on. And I feel like that's a universal reaction. So if Leslie had seen the figure of a man, that would have meant that he would have put the brakes on, or at least looked shocked, maybe. I don't know. That's not ruling out that maybe seeing this figure in the blue overalls over the winter of 1974 into 1975, maybe he'd been a premonition of what was to come. That I could see as a possibility, as I'm not sure whether he was seen afterwards. But yeah, whatever happened with Leslie, whatever was the cause, the true facts are that this was a horrendous tragedy. It did bring about the introduction of an emergency brake system called the Moorgate Protection, or Train Entering Terminal Station System, which would automatically apply the brakes if a train was travelling too fast into a terminal station like Moorgate. Safety rules written in blood and all of that. Because people died, and even more are still living with the very real effects of this. And that's the important bit to remember out of this whole thing. Which, unfortunately, the same can be said for the next haunted stop that we're coming to along the Northern Line. Because a bit further north, we come to King's Cross Station. And King's Cross obviously isn't just a tube station. The railway station actually opened earlier in 1852, but the connected tube station opened in 1907 as part of the extension for the City and South London line. But it was here that the worst fire in the history of the London Underground happened, on the 18th of November 1987. It was just before 7:30 in the evening, and the station was still reasonably busy with the last of rush hour commuters making their way home, when the alarm was raised by a passenger that one of the wooden escalators up from the Piccadilly line seemed to be on fire. And at first, it seemed like the fire was pretty contained. It looked like it was going to be pretty easy to handle. Emergency services were called, and one described the fire as about the size of a large cardboard box, which is an incredible size comparison. But very quickly, things took a major turn for the worse. Because of the incline of the escalators, something happened called the trench effect, which was previously completely unheard of. But heat and flames were funneled up the wooden escalators, a bit like a blowtorch, which erupted into the ticket hall in a fireball, turning the blaze deadly in an instant. Hundreds of people were trapped on the tube platforms underneath the fire, but they managed to escape on the underground trains. People caught in the ticket hall at the time were not so lucky. Firefighters continued to battle the blaze and eventually brought it under control at about 10 to 10 that night, with it being fully extinguished at 1:45 in the morning. There was a clock at the top of the escalator where the fire had first started, which had stopped at 7:45 p.m, the exact time that the intense inferno had burned through its wiring. After the fire had been put out, it was time for the search and rescue to start. 31 people had died in the fire though, with 100 more being hospitalised from their injuries. Among the dead was a high-ranking firefighter, Station Officer Colin Townsley. He was found lying next to the body of a badly burned passenger. He died a hero, trying to get as many people out of the burning building as he could. The investigation into the fire found that it had started when a lit match had fallen between a gap in the wooden escalator, which had then set fire to the built-up grease and litter that had accumulated underneath there. I feel like it's an important thing to note that that underneath area hadn't been cleared out since the 1940s. Something that I thought was very strange when I came across it though, was that some people thought that the Pet Shop Boys, of all people, had actually predicted this disaster. Because in September 1987, just a couple of months before the fire, they had released their album titled Actually. And one of the songs on that album was called King's Cross. And what stuck out to a lot of people was the line, "Dead and wounded on either side, you know it's only a matter of time." Once the fire had happened, and there were, unfortunately, dead and wounded in King's Cross, people made the connection. Neil Tennant did go on record to say that that line was in reference to the AIDS epidemic, which had become a global health crisis during that time. But even so, people thought it was a very strange coincidence. There is now a memorial plaque to the victims of that devastating 1987 fire, but some believe that there are other remnants left over from that awful night. Because in 1998, one commuter at King's Cross saw a woman in one of the corridors of the station. She had long brown hair and was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, so looking relatively modern. But what struck this witness was that this woman was absolutely distraught. She was kneeling down on the side, screaming, arms outstretched like she'd just been given absolutely gut-wrenching news. Obviously, this witness's first instinct was to go over and help the woman, at least get her up off the floor, try and calm her down, anything like that. But as they took a step towards her, another commuter coming from the other way walked straight through this woman, completely oblivious to her, as if she wasn't even there at all. And so some believe that perhaps she was a victim of the tragedy or in some way connected to it. Although some have pointed out that the woman was witnessed wearing jeans and a t-shirt, which wouldn't have exactly been normal clothing for wintertime in London, so there is that. I did come across a different explanation which said that perhaps this woman was nothing to do with the fire, but instead she was one of the many people who chose to end their lives in the London Underground. And maybe that's why she's still seen down there. But in reality, we just don't really know. But aside from this sighting of a woman, some people have been hit with the unmistakable smell of smoke while walking to their platform at King's Cross. But just as thick and fast as the smell appears, disappears again. The figure of a man has also been seen down on the underground platforms too, but similarly to the woman, we don't know who he is. All we know is that he's seen boarding one of the tube trains, but after that, he just completely disappears. I'm gonna need to know at what time he's boarding these trains. I'd say if it was during rush hour, it's pretty difficult to keep track of people at that point. 100 times creepier if he's disappearing late at night on one of the last trains of the evening though. I will grant you that. But there still very much could be something to it, as a Freedom of Information request in 2023 found only one official report of ghosts across the London Underground network, and it was at King's Cross. Apparently, a 15-year-old boy had been absolutely terrified and had told Transport for London staff that he had seen ghosts on the platform of the Metropolitan line. We don't know what specifically he saw, but it's an interesting little detail about this station anyway. But travelling a little further north on the Northern Line, and there's another one that I need to tell you about, but it's not necessarily for the ghost stories, but because there is a very interesting legend connected very close by. We're stopping at Camden Town Station, because this one, it sits pretty much on a busy crossroads nowadays, but back in the 17th century, there used to be a cottage here on that junction, and a woman lived in this cottage called Ginny Bingham. Now, she had a bit of a reputation anyway. Her parents had been executed for witchcraft, and that kind of thing, that sticks to family members as well. So she was guilty by association, in the eyes of the locals at least. Not helped by the fact that the first fella she was with was executed at Tyburn for sheep stealing, and then the next guy just disappeared without a trace one day. But the guy after that, his charred remains were found in her oven. And the only reason that she got away with it, they had her banged to rights, until someone piped up at the trial and said that this guy had had a habit of hiding out in the oven to get away from her. And so it must have just been an accident that the oven was turned on while he was still in there. That is a heck of a hiding place though. I'm sure you can think of a few safer places you can slink off to until she calms down. Anyway, as Ginny got older and all of these circumstances seemed to crop up around her, she was seen as a foul-mouthed, violent, terrifying old woman who had followed in her parents' footsteps and turned to black magic. She had a few nicknames known as Mother Damnable, Mother Redcap, or even the Shrew of Kentish Town, living in a ramshackle cottage with a black cat for company. That's not going to help when you are literally living with the very embodiment of what a witch's familiar looks like, but anyway. I don't know where my familiars are today. They seem to have left me. I used to have them all the time, and now they don't want to know me, so that's great. But one night, it is said that locals witnessed the devil himself enter her cottage. They carried on keeping an eye on the place, seeing how this was going to play out, but they never saw him leave. The next morning, curiosity got the better of them, and some of the braver locals poked their head around the door to the cottage to find Ginny slumped over in her chair in front of the fireplace, dead. In her hands, she was still holding a teapot containing what looked to be drugs, herbs, and liquid. To their mind, the best way to test what was in this teapot was to feed it to the poor cat, where the story goes that all of his fur fell out within 2 hours and he died soon afterwards. So there's a little bit of debate online as to whether her cottage actually stood where the tube station right now is, or whether it was in fact where the pub The World's End is. Which, interesting little side fact, that used to be called Mother Redcap, so there's that. But people travelling through Camden Town Station do sometimes comment on the oppressive atmosphere in that building. Whether that's anything to do with being the site that the devil himself once apparently visited, or more about commuting, I'd feel a pretty oppressive atmosphere if I'd have been caught in those tube strikes. Sheesh. But moving further north and going up the High Barnet branch, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I have something to say about Highgate Station. And I say unsurprisingly because Highgate is probably one of the most famous cemeteries, being the final resting place for people from George Michael to Karl Marx, as well as, obviously, being super haunted, potentially by a vampire. Oh yeah, you know I'm definitely going to be covering that place at some point. But anyway, Highgate Station's hauntings don't actually have anything to do with the cemetery. That was just a little tangent I went on. But basically, above the current Highgate tube station, there used to be a steam railway line that ran all the way up to Alexandria Palace. That line shut down before World War II, but during the war, there were actually plans to bring it into the fold, make it part of the underground network. But all that didn't pan out, and so that was that. After the railway line had been shut down though, and the tracks lifted up and removed, neighbours would hear the sounds of steam engines continuing to use those tracks. And logically, okay, yeah, that's a bit weird, but you know, sound can echo in weird ways, travel further than you think it might, and so maybe, I don't know, you're hearing steam engines from further away, possibly. But these stories carried on long after the closure, right on into the 1970s, well after steam trains were no longer in use. People would just be sitting in their houses, hearing the chug of steam trains and the whistle echoing, knowing full well that there shouldn't be any of those types of trains there. So if you're doing a haunted London Underground tour on the Northern Line, maybe pop up above ground at Highgate and see if you can hear anything. But there's one more station that I need to tell you about on the Northern Line, and it's perhaps the most famous? Infamous? I had to do the typical YouTuber thing and do it out of geographical order just so I could talk about this one last, because I'm so annoying like that. But people who have watched the Ghosts of the Underground documentary already know which station I'm going to be talking about. It's Kennington, or rather more specifically the Kennington Loop. So the station itself was built by City and South London Railway in 1890, but a loop was added in the 1920s to allow trains coming from Waterloo Station to terminate there. And passengers aren't technically allowed to ride the loop. That train terminates at Kennington. Everyone is told to get off before the train then goes into the loop to turn around. But I'm sure at least some drivers, they probably wish that they could get off too, as some do admit that riding through the Kennington Loop can be super creepy. They'll be down there sitting and waiting in the dark, hoping that their signal's about to change, but then they hear it. The slam of a carriage door, and then another, carriage by carriage, getting closer and closer, as if someone is walking the length of the train, heading straight towards them. And there was one guard, a guy called Larry, who swore it happened to him. He was stuck in the loop, sitting alone in the rearmost carriage, when he heard these doors opening and closing, one after the other. Finally, the door to his cabin creaked open. He turned, expecting to see nothing else but his driver, who should have been the only other person on the train, but there was nobody there. Another employee waiting in the Kennington Loop, a driver called Bob, he reported the exact same thing. Same sounds, same terrifying build-up, same empty train when he turned around. But Bob and Larry's experiences had happened 4 years apart. The two men didn't even know each other, hadn't worked together, anything like that. The odds of two guys imagining the exact same haunting happening in the exact same place does make you think. For other people, the whole thing is even more confusing. There was one guard who had recently started working on the Northern Line when he again heard the sounds of the doors opening and closing. He looked behind him to see two track maintenance workers who must have just boarded the train, and they were walking towards him. Okay, well, I guess that explains the sounds, whatever I guess. I don't know how common it is for employees to just board trains like that though, while it's just waiting in the tunnels. That seems a bit odd, but maybe someone who's more informed can help in the comments on that one. The guard turned back round and just waited for the maintenance guys to reach him, but the interconnecting doors stopped opening and closing. There was just silence. Alright then. The guard turned back around to find that there was no one else on the train. He buzzed the driver on the intercom who was sat at the other end and asked, "Oh, who were those two maintenance guys that had got on board?" The driver had no idea what he was talking about. No one was on the train but the guard and the driver. There had never been any maintenance workers there. Obviously, he was not believing the driver. He'd seen these men with his own eyes, and so he walked the carriages where he had seen them. Yeah, there was no one there. Apparently, it has happened a lot more too, mainly just the doors opening and closing, and a lot of drivers try to dismiss what they see and experience in the loop as, oh, it's just a draft, it's just the wind. I don't know about you, but does wind shut the door behind it before opening up the next door? Very polite, if so. Or maybe a bit like Skyrim bandits before I get them with a stealth arrow, they like to say it's just the wind to make themselves feel better. But these stories from the Kennington Loop, they've been reported for decades, although no one really knows what's going on here. Who or what is causing this activity? What happened? There have been a couple of theories. Some say that it's connected to a passenger who tried to board a train, but was instead dragged underneath into the loop where he unfortunately died. Others say that instead it was the maintenance worker who was down doing a job in the area, the one in South Island Place in the 1950s, where he was either hit by a train or electrocuted. Both just utterly nasty ways to go, let's be honest. But if this was the same guy opening train doors in the Kennington Loop, he does also venture out through the tunnels, as his misty grey figure has also been seen walking the tracks. And he's described as just walking along, looking pretty preoccupied, not really focusing on what he's doing, sometimes with his tilly lamp, other times not, before he's spotted, usually by the train drivers on the Northern Line, and he just disappears. But whoever it is, whether the maintenance guy or a passenger killed in the loop, again, we don't have any records of deaths happening down there in the area. It's just all a bit of urban legend, which doesn't help the creepy reputation of Kennington Loop, responsible for disorientating tired passengers who fall asleep at Kennington Station, but wake up at the next station along, which is also Kennington. But the Northern Line, built out of two tangled railways stitched together, is home to more history and unfortunately tragedies than most of us will ever stop to think about while we're rushing to our next train. But with a past like this, is it any wonder that so many people say that the Northern Line is haunted? So maybe next time you're standing at your platform, just take a moment to safely peek down the tunnel, because down there you never really know who or what could be watching you back. But if you've ever been on the Northern Line and experienced something a bit strange, please do share it in the comments. When I was starting the research for this one, I had no idea that there were so many haunted stations connected to the Northern Line. I had to actually cut out the ones that weren't exclusively part of this line, as there were just too many. So I'm telling you now, when I get to covering the Bakerloo line, that is going to be another episode and a half. But anyway, getting ahead of myself, I'm not at all surprised that there are so many ghost stories. Balham and the tragedy during the war, Moorgate, the King's Cross fire, Stockwell in 2005, all just horrifically tragic events that are gonna leave their mark energetically on the place. But then on the other side of it, are these stories coming about because people expect them to be there? They know a tragedy happened here, and so one must precede the other? Because then the stories of the maintenance worker in Moorgate and near Stockwell, and then in the Kennington Loop, are these urban legends all just merging into each other as the story gets told and retold? But for me, I do believe that people experience strange things down on the Northern Line. I do think that some of these stations are haunted. And even if it's not necessarily strictly ghosts, that energy, that is going to still be lingering down there. But let me know what you think, how you feel about it all. The biggest question I have about the whole thing is, how did they know that it was the devil that was visiting Jenny Bingham? It was just categorically the devil came to visit. How do you know? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, there is something that you could do for me to show your support. It doesn't cost you anything, but YouTube has brought about this new feature called hyping, where you hype a video, and it helps channels under 500,000 subscribers to push their new content out there. And so I tried to figure it out on the laptop, couldn't figure it out. So if you go onto mobile and go into the little box where the comments are and then swipe across, you'll see this hype button. And you can only give out hype points 3 times a week, I think. But YouTube seems to really be pushing it now. So if you're able to spare one for me, it would mean the world. Thank you so much. But you also can't beat the classics, so making sure that you're subscribed means that you'll hopefully never miss another new episode. Only if you enjoy what I'm doing here and you actually want to come back for another episode, of course. Between hype and hitting subscribe, those are the best ways to keep this channel and all of your favourite creators' channels growing. But anyway, that is all from me today. I have talked at you for long enough. Haven't I, Ivy? Go get a drink of water. You're not a true Londoner unless you carry your water bottle around with you on the tube. It gets warm down there. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I'm feeling particularly over-caffeinated today, so for all of the people complaining at me that I talk too fast, good luck.